Imagine you're a monk. It's a quiet Tuesday morning in 793 AD. You're doing what you do every day, praying, copying scriptures, tending your garden on a tiny island off the coast of England called Lindisfarne. Then, someone screams. You look up and see them. Ships. Dragon-headed ships. Moving fast, too fast, and before you can even process what's happening, they're already on shore, and they are not here to talk. What happened next was so brutal, so shocking, that Christian scholars across all of Europe genuinely believed it was the end of the world. Men of God slaughtered at the altar, sacred treasures ripped from the walls, survivors dragged in chains onto those ships, never to see home again. The sea ran red, and just as fast as they came, they vanished back into the fog. Nobody knew where they came from. Nobody knew when they'd return. Nobody knew how to stop them. Europe had just met the Vikings. But here's the thing, and this is what most people get completely wrong. That raid, that single terrifying morning, that was just the opening act. Because the people who did that weren't mindless savages. They had laws more advanced than most of Europe. They had poets. They had explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus. They had women who owned property, ran businesses, and commanded respect in ways that would make most medieval queens jealous. They were brutal, yes, but they were also brilliant. And over the next hour, we are going to walk through the entire world they built. From the moment a Viking child took their first breath in a frozen longhouse, to the moment their age changed history forever. So settle in, because this story, it does not disappoint. To be born in the Viking Age was to be born into a land that never gave freely. The fjords were steep and cold, the winters long and merciless, the soil thin and stubborn. Life itself was a struggle against the elements, and every child who entered this world carried the weight of survival from the first breath. Infancy in the north was not gentle. It was precarious, fragile, balanced always on the edge of fate. Many would not live past their first year. Yet for those who did, every small victory, a cry in the cold air, a heartbeat that refused to fade, was the first step in becoming part of one of the most formidable societies Europe had ever known. A newborn Viking was not greeted only as a child, but as a question. Would this small life endure the storms, the hunger, the disease? The answer was uncertain, and the community knew it. Rituals surrounded the earliest days, marking the child as accepted or not. Before the naming ceremony, before water was sprinkled on the infant to welcome it into the family, the child's place was not secure. Some were left to die if they were born weak, deformed, or unwanted, exposed to the elements, a grim reminder that in the Viking world, survival was never a gift, only a test. To modernize, it may seem cruel, but in the North, families could not afford the burden of those unlikely to survive. Each life was measured against necessity. And yet, for those accepted, there was warmth. The longhouse was both protection and crucible. Inside, infants were cradled close to their mothers by the fire, wrapped in wool against the biting wind. The smell of smoke and the constant murmur of voices were their first sensations. These were communal homes, where kin and servants shared space, and so a child was never raised alone. Women, the keepers of households, watched over them, but every member of the family played a role. Life in the longhouse was a collective endeavor, and even infancy reflected this truth. Mothers were fierce in their devotion, though their love was shaped by necessity. They carried infants as they worked, grinding grain, tending animals, weaving cloth, always moving, always laboring. A baby's cries mingled with the rhythm of chores, the pounding of tools, the bleating of goats. Fathers, often away for trade or raiding, were distant figures in infancy, but their shadow loomed in the expectations set from the very beginning. Boys were future warriors, girls future keepers of heart and land. From the moment of naming, each child was bound to the destiny of the clan. The naming ceremony itself carried weight. It was not merely the giving of a word, but the granting of identity, of belonging. A bowl of water was used, sometimes blessed, sprinkled on the infant to signify life and welcome. The name chosen often reached backward, pulling from ancestors, heroes, or the gods themselves. A boy might be named after Thor, hoping for strength,
or after a grandfather, hoping to inherit his fortune and reputation. A girl might carry the name of a strong mother or grandmother, her identity bound to memory as much as to future. Names mattered deeply, for in Norse belief, to be named was to be tied into the fabric of fate.
From their earliest days, infants were surrounded by stories. The sagas, recited by parents and grandparents alike, were not just entertainment, but education. Even a child too young to understand the words absorbed their rhythms, the cadence of memory and myth. They were sung to sleep not with gentle lullabies, but with verses that spoke of gods, giants, and heroes. Odin's sacrifice on the tree, Thor's battles with the Midgard serpent, the Norns weaving the threads of fate. These tales shaped the air itself in which a child grew. In time, they would not merely hear these stories, but live by their weight. The danger of death was constant. Disease struck quickly and without mercy. Fevers, infections, or the simple inability to thrive claimed many before their first winter was out. In this, Viking families relied on both practical care and superstition. Mothers knew herbs that soothed fevers or settled a child's stomach. Amulets were tied around necks, small Thor's hammers carved from bone or bronze to ward off ill fortune. The gods were invoked, sacrifices made, every means of protection summoned to guard the fragile spark of life. But always, fate was sovereign. If the Norns had cut a thread short, no prayer could lengthen it. Those who lived grew quickly into the rhythms of their world. Even as infants, they were accustomed to the constant movement of Viking life. They were carried on journeys, rocked in cradles shaped like boats, lulled to sleep by the creak of timber and the crash of waves if families traveled by sea. Some were left in the care of siblings, barely older children themselves, who learned responsibility through necessity. Others grew in households where bonds of kinship stretched wide, where uncles, aunts, and cousins all shared in raising the young. To be Viking was not to be raised in isolation, but in community. The world around them was never gentle. Winter nights stretched endlessly, darkness pressing close to the longhouse, wolves howling in the distance. Food was not always abundant. Famine struck, crops failed, and even the youngest felt the strain as milk thinned or meals were rationed. Hardship was not hidden from them. From the start, they learned that life was uncertain, that endurance was everything. This early exposure to scarcity forged a people who valued toughness, adaptability, and resilience above all. Infancy was also the first introduction to honor and shame, though in ways too subtle for the child to grasp. Parents took pride in strong babies, in those who grew quickly, cried loudly, and survived illness. Weakness was a source of quiet fear, whispered about around fires. Survival was not merely personal, it reflected on the family, on the lineage. Each child was both an individual and an extension of clan honor. Their lives were threads woven into a greater tapestry, and if they frayed too soon, the whole fabric felt the strain. Religion surrounded every aspect of this early life. Infants were not just children of their families, but children of the gods. A newborn might be dedicated to Thor for protection, or to Frey for fertility and prosperity. Offerings were made, sometimes of food, sometimes of animals, asking the gods to spare the child and bless their future. The gods were not distant figures, but constant presences, woven into the smoke of the hearth, the storms outside, the animals in the fields. To grow Viking was to grow in a world alive with divine presence, where every survival was a gift, and every death a reminder of fate's power. The role of women in these earliest years cannot be overstated. Viking mothers held authority, managing households while fathers traveled or fought. They were guardians of the family's survival, fierce and practical, teaching their children by example. Girls, especially, absorbed these lessons from infancy, raised in the presence of strong women who commanded respect in a way rare for their time. This foundation gave Viking society a balance of roles, with women as central to survival as men. Infancy was short. Childhood came swiftly, responsibilities even faster. By the age of 3 or 4, children were expected to contribute in small ways, tending animals, fetching water, learning the patterns of labor. But those earliest years had already done their work. A Viking infant who lived had survived the harshest test, the fragility of life, in a world that killed easily. Those who endured carried invisible scars of that struggle. They had been hardened by fire, smoke, hunger, and cold long before they could understand it. And yet, amidst the harshness, there was warmth. Families loved deeply, even if their love was expressed in sternness rather than softness. Mothers sang, fathers told stories, siblings played games in the dirt or snow. Joy existed, fleeting but real. The joy of a child's first steps, a baby's laugh, the survival of another winter.
It was these small moments that made endurance worthwhile, that gave meaning to the relentless struggle. To be born Viking was to be born into a paradox, cherished yet tested, protected yet exposed, loved yet expected to endure. Infancy was the first trial, the foundation upon which all future strength was built. The sagas remembered heroes and kings, warriors and explorers, but every one of them had begun here, as a fragile child in a smoke-filled longhouse, their survival uncertain, their future already bound to fate. By the time a Viking child grew into early boyhood or girlhood, they had already absorbed the lessons of endurance. They had survived exposure, hunger, and sickness. They had heard the names of gods and ancestors whispered over them, felt the cold breath of winter nights, and seen death touch those around them. Infancy was never a gentle season, it was a forge. And those who passed through it emerged tempered for the life that awaited them, a life of hardship, of endurance, of journeys across sea and land, and of a destiny that would shape the memory of Europe for centuries to come.
You grow fast in the north. There is no luxury of long childhoods where curiosity can drift for years. From the moment you can walk, the longhouse becomes both classroom and training ground, an environment where every small movement is noticed and every small task has meaning. The rhythms of life, dawn chores, tending animals, mending nets, helping at the hearth, settle into your body before you fully understand why they matter. Work is never distant from play. A wooden sword becomes practice in stance and balance. A carved boat on the tide is a first lesson in wind and current. Mothers and older siblings teach with hands as much as with words, correcting a grip, showing how to split kindling, guiding your small feet along the same paths the elders have walked for generations. These early, repeated movements are not trivial. They build muscles and instincts that will be called upon in storm and siege, on market days and in raids. The longhouse hums with life, voices layered over the crackle of peat and the scent of smoked meat. This is the soundscape you learn to move within, to listen for, to respond. There is a practicality to the lessons you receive. Nothing is abstract. You learn measurement by weighing grain, judgment by deciding which animal must be slaughtered and which must wait, patience by watching a net mended carefully under the glow of the lamp. Your toys are tools, a small oar, a practice bow, a crude loom, each shaped to teach a specific skill. Girls and boys are taught different patterns because different burdens will rest upon them. But their education overlaps. Both must know how to handle a blade, mend a sail, and read the weather. The seasons are master teachers. Winter teaches ration and repair. Spring teaches planting and hope. Summer teaches harvest and endurance. Autumn teaches preparation and storage. You feel the cycle in your bones and learn to plan not for a single day, but for seasons ahead. The family's survival depends on this forethought, and you are part of the calculation. Play, in this world, sharpens the senses rather than dulls them. The games you play with other children are rigorous exercises in balance, timing, and situational awareness. Wrestling on frozen ground teaches where to place your weight. Mock raids along the shoreline teach stealth and quick assessment of danger. Racing across rocky paths teaches the agility you will need when a herd or a band of raiders appears without warning. The community notices these small contests. Praise is doled out not for mere success, but for measured risk, for ingenuity, for the ability to withdraw at the right moment. Shame is likewise instructive. A public failure can stoke a child's resolve or harden them with embarrassment. These lessons in social consequence are as important as any lesson in craftsmanship. Your reputation will open doors or slam them shut when you are older. Hands-on apprenticeship begins early and is often informal but intense. From 5 or 6, you may be trusted with minor responsibilities at the shipyard, passing tools, holding a carved plank steady, learning the language of pins and keels by feel. The sound of an experienced shipwright's hammer is as instructive as any lecture. You learn the grain of wood, where a plank will bend and where it will snap, how caulking must be pressed and dried. In the field, you learn to read land and sea. The way moss grows on a boulder hints at north and south. The bite of wind at dusk forecasts the coming squall. You discover how to tend animals, to mend nets, to treat a sprain with boiled herbs and a tight bandage. Practical skill breeds quiet confidence. Those small, mundane competencies become the scaffolding upon which greater feats, long voyages, complex negotiations, the management of a household are built.
Daily life also teaches the subtler arts of social navigation. The Thing, the local assembly, is a place you will watch and one day attend in shadow. Here, disputes are aired, debts recorded, alliances declared. Even as a child, you overhear arguments and watch gestures, learning how a leader speaks with measured weight, how a man can win a hearing by telling a concise, truthful story. Trade is a lesson in psychology. You learn to offer, to press, to yield, and to take a small victory when it appears. Merchants who arrive from distant lands bring new words, new fabrics, strange coins. Their presence teaches adaptability. It is in these marketplaces that children first taste the wider world. Amber from the Baltic, silver from the south, spices whose names are songs. These items are not mere luxury. They are signs of networks and paths that someone from your longhouse might one day follow. Religion and luck are woven through everything, shaping how you interpret the world. Little amulets, Thor's hammer carved from bone or iron, hang from babies' necks and are tightened into the cords of young ones. You learn to leave a cut of meat by the threshold to appease household spirits, to listen for omens in the flight of birds, to consult a seer about timing for a voyage. These practices are not primitive superstition in the way some later commentators sneered. They are shared systems for making sense of risk.
When a storm arises unexpectedly, the community looks for meaning and for guidance on how to act. Rituals give structure to uncertainty. They teach that human agency and fate are partners, and that you must prepare well, because the gods are not obliged to intervene. Affection and sorrow grow together in the longhouse. Parents are stern because stakes are high, but that sternness includes fierce care. You see mothers feed their infants from the same hand that will scold a teenager for laziness. You watch siblings tend one another's wounds after a fall from a cart, share a last piece of dried fish in lean months, and laugh until dusk at some clever insult. Loss is common and shapes you early. A friend claimed by fever, a neighbor's child carried off in winter. These shreds of grief teach perspective and a stoic compassion. Funerary rites, small in scale but profound in feeling, show you how a community honors those it has lost and reasserts the continuity of kinship. Such moments teach that life is fragile, and therefore each day of courage and care matters. As you near adolescence, expectation tightens into clear paths, the ship's deck or the household's hearth. Boys who show aptitude at rowing and seamanship may be taken on short coastal voyages, testing their sea legs and their ability to take orders. They are not always armed on these first trips. Observation and obedience are the lessons. Girls who manage livestock and stores with skill gain authority in household decisions and may be sought in marriage by men of standing. Yet these paths are not strict prisons. Stories in your family might celebrate a woman who negotiated a peace, a man who turned a ruin into a trading post, how cunning sometimes trumped raw force. The cultural ideal rewards adaptability and the clever use of resources. The childhood years are a slow compression into responsibilities and identity. You leave them not with a single dramatic ceremony, but with a quiet accumulation of skills, memories, stories, and tested loyalties. You have been taught the craft of living in a place that asks relentlessly, can you endure? Can you adapt? Can you honor your kin? These lessons are not abstract. They are the daily work of tending animals at dawn, of mending a net at dusk, of repeating a saga until its cadence becomes part of your speech. When the time comes to step further into adulthood, to join a crew on a longer voyage, to stand in the Thing and speak for your family, to assume the household's responsibilities, you do so already tempered by the small trials of childhood. The shape of your people grows in you early and deep, so that the courage and cunning expected of you in later years feel less like demands and more like the next stages of a life you already know how to live. Adolescence in the Viking world was not a liminal dream of half childhood and half adulthood. It was a crucible where identity was tempered and tested. By the time you reached 12 or 13, your body was expected to labor as fully as any adult's, and your voice was expected to carry weight in the household. The line between child and grown was blurred not by age, but by responsibility. The farm, the longship, the market, each demanded that you step forward and prove your place. These years were relentless in shaping you, not only through work and instruction, but through deliberate trials that marked the community's recognition of your transition. For boys, the sea became the final teacher. Small journeys had already acquainted you with oar and rope, but now you were placed more fully in the rhythm of the crew. The oar was no longer practice, it was life or death. A poorly pulled stroke could break timing, slow the ship, endanger all aboard in rough waters. Older men watched closely, gauging whether you were attentive, whether you learned quickly, whether you endured the endless ache in your arms without complaint. The sea was merciless in instruction. Salt stung your eyes, blisters tore at your palms, and cold spray soaked your clothes. But to falter was shameful. To endure silently was honor. Beyond labor, you were asked to notice, to memorize coastal markers, to recognize a sudden shift of wind, to hear in the timbre of the waves a storm rising. Seamanship was an apprenticeship in vigilance, and vigilance was survival. For girls, adolescence demanded mastery of the household's economy, which was no small domain. A Viking home was not a passive shelter, but a center of production, weaving, dairying, brewing, curing, managing stores of grain and fish. Adolescent girls learned to weave not simply for clothing, but for sails, the very fabric that made voyages possible. To oversee a loom was to wield economic power, for the value of fine cloth was immense. They managed supplies with exacting care, calculating what could be consumed and what must be preserved through winter. Authority grew here. A girl who could run a household with efficiency gained respect that echoed beyond the walls of her home, shaping marriages and alliances. Women were entrusted with property and could inherit in the absence of male heirs, and adolescence was the threshold where such responsibilities became tangible. Yet trials were not confined to daily duties. Communities often imposed deliberate rites of testing, subtle or overt, to mark the turning of a youth toward adulthood. A boy might be challenged to spend nights alone in the forest or on an island, armed only with a knife, expected to return with proof of skill, a snared animal, a carved token, a tale of endurance. Hunger, cold, and fear were the tutors in such solitude, stripping away comfort and demanding resourcefulness. A girl might be pressed into organizing a feast or managing the stores for a season under watchful eyes, her decisions scrutinized for wisdom and foresight. In both cases, the trial was not spectacle, but verification. Was the young person ready to shoulder responsibility without constant guidance? Readiness was not proclaimed in words, but shown in actions. Physical training also sharpened during adolescence. Wrestling and swordplay became more serious, no longer games, but rehearsals for real conflict. Wooden swords gave way to blunted iron. Shields were not toys, but heavy burdens to be lifted and braced. Duels among youths were common, both supervised contests and unsanctioned tests of pride. Bruises and cuts were inevitable, but each scar became part of the language of growth. Songs and sagas praised endurance more than victory. To lose well, to rise quickly, to accept pain with dignity was more admired than to win through arrogance. Combat training was a rehearsal for the ethos of the shield wall, where discipline mattered more than individual glory. Religion and belief infused these years deeply. Adolescence was often the stage when individuals first sought personal encounters with the divine, whether through dreams, omens, or rituals of dedication. Some carried Thor's hammer, others invoked Freya's blessing for fertility and prosperity, others whispered to Odin for wisdom and courage. Offerings might be made in secret, a carved figure left by a tree, a handful of grain at a shrine. This spiritual seeking was not separate from practical life. It accompanied the strain of labor, the uncertainty of voyages, the risks of childbirth. Adolescents learned that fate, or weird, was woven long before their birth, but that courage and cunning could shape how that fate unfolded. Social bonds shifted too. Friendships forged in childhood games deepened into alliances that would shape adult lives. Groups of boys trained together, hunted together, sailed together, becoming small cohorts that might one day crew a ship. Groups of girls shared tasks, songs, and secrets, building networks that would endure into marriage and household management. Early love appeared in glances, in gifts of carved bone or small treasures, in whispered words around the fire. Marriages were arranged more often by family negotiation than romantic impulse, but affection and loyalty could still take root early. Adolescence was where reputation was most fragile. A careless insult, a cowardly act, a lapse in judgment could linger for years. Honor was currency, and each action added or subtracted from its store. The Thing began to admit adolescents in shadow roles, watching silently as elders debated. Here you learned the rhythm of law, oaths sworn on sacred rings, disputes mediated with compensation, the way a man's word could weigh as much as his sword. You observed of honor was not only defended by blade, but by eloquence, by the ability to craft a laconic yet sharp statement that silenced opposition. Adolescents learned the duality of Viking power, strength on the field, cunning in the hall. To master both was the mark of greatness.
Travel expanded horizons. Adolescents might accompany a trading voyage, venturing beyond familiar fjords to markets in Denmark, England, or even further. To step onto a foreign shore was to see new peoples, new goods, new dangers. Such journeys were not leisure. They demanded alertness, humility, and flexibility. The clamor of a marketplace where 10 languages echoed taught that adaptability was as important as endurance. Adolescents returned with eyes widened, bearing stories of lands beyond the horizon, shaping ambition for future years. Adolescence in the Viking Age was therefore not a gentle preparation, but a series of accelerations into responsibility. It compressed skill, faith, social standing, and physical endurance into a few short years, so that by the time you stood at the edge of adulthood, you already carried the weight of a hardened worker, a capable fighter, a budding leader. Each scar, each memory, each decision was a stone added to the foundation of your identity. There was little patience for delay. A weak adult endangered the community. And so adolescence was less an age of waiting than an age of forging. By the time you emerged from its trials, you were no longer an uncertain youth, but a participant in the full machinery of Viking life, ready to take your place at the oar, at the loom, at the council, or at the altar.
Adulthood in the Viking Age was not a sudden leap, but a slow crossing of thresholds, each marked by work, by ritual, and by the quiet recognition of the community. A boy who once stood at the edge of the longhouse fire, listening to elders whisper sagas, now rose with the men at dawn to tend to animals, sharpen tools, and ready the longship when the season demanded it. A girl who once wove simple cords at her mother's side now oversaw looms large enough to clothe a family, or stood in the smoky air of the kitchen hut, preparing meals that would feed warriors after long days of toil. Responsibility came early, and it came heavily, and the weight of adulthood was rarely eased. For in this world where winters froze deep and storms could swallow whole ships, there was little room for idleness, little patience for those who could not pull their share. The daily rhythms of adulthood were measured less by hours of the clock and more by the sun's slow climb and descent, by the turning of seasons, and by the urgent needs of the farm. Men spent long hours in the fields, bending their backs to sow barley and rye, clearing brush, or repairing fences and sheds worn down by wind. In coastal settlements, fishing was no less vital. Nets had to be woven and mended, boats caulked and tarred against leaks, lines baited with care. The sea gave generously, but it also took without mercy. To be an adult man in Viking society meant to face that bargain daily, to risk body and breath against waves, trusting skill and luck in equal measure. Yet, adulthood was not only the work of survival, it was also the work of continuity. Marriage often came young by modern standards, not always for love, but for alliance, for the weaving together of kin and fortune. Families sought to strengthen their ties with neighbors, to secure land, or to gain allies in uncertain times. A bride might bring a dowry of cloth, livestock, or household tools, while the groom's family offered weapons, silver, or property in return. The wedding itself was a binding of two lines, a sacred act overseen by both families and blessed under the gaze of the gods. Torches were lit, feasts were laid out, horns of mead passed hand to hand, and in the binding of hands or the sharing of a bed, the community saw its own survival carried forward. For women, adulthood often meant mastery of the household, but this was no small role. In many Viking farms, it was the woman who held the keys, literal iron keys that hung from her belt, signaling authority over stores, chests, and supplies. She ensured food was preserved through winter, clothing spun and dyed, medicines gathered, and children reared. In sagas, strong women are remembered not as passive figures, but as decision-makers, guardians of honor, even goaders who pushed men into action when reputation demanded it. A wife might manage the farm alone if her husband was raiding abroad for months at a time, proving herself every bit as capable in endurance and judgment as the men she stood beside. Adulthood also carried a religious weight. A man or woman now took part not only in labor, but in rituals that bound the community to the divine. The bloat, a sacrificial feast to the gods, required organization and offerings, often animals raised with care throughout the year. Adults stood in the ring, hands stained with the blood of the slaughtered beast, and accepted the blessings of Odin, Thor, or Freyr upon their crops and kin. These rites confirmed one's place in a chain that stretched backward to ancestors and forward to descendants yet unborn. To take part was to say, I am no longer a child at the edge of the fire. I stand within it,
with all the weight and privilege that implies. Feasting itself was a theater of adulthood. The longhouse roared with laughter, with boasts, with the thundering rhythm of fists striking tables as stories were told. Here, status was displayed in the seating order, in the richness of meat served, in the size of drinking horns. Adults measured themselves against one another in wit and words as much as in the field of battle. Skalds, the poets, recited verses, praising some, mocking others, but always reminding the hall that reputation was as fragile as glass and as enduring as stone, depending on how one lived. To be a grown man or woman in Viking society was to know that every action could echo long after death, in tales, in runes, in the whispers of neighbors. Of course, adulthood carried shadow as well as light. With the rights of marriage and property came the obligations of feud and vengeance. If a relative was insulted or slain, an adult man could not simply look away. Honor required action, negotiation if possible, blood if necessary. Women, too, could demand justice, calling upon brothers or husbands to act when family pride was wounded. The sagas tell us that disputes over land, inheritance, or insulted words spiraled into conflicts that lasted generations, each adult drawn into the cycle of obligation and retribution. To stand aside was to risk being branded coward, to lose not just face, but the respect that anchored survival in a tightly knit society.
Psychologically, adulthood in the Viking world carried a burden most of us cannot imagine. Mortality loomed near at every turn. Disease, accident, hunger, war. A man might not live past 35. A woman might die in childbirth before her hair turned silver. To be an adult was to carry the knowledge of death constantly, yet not to surrender to despair. Instead, the culture embraced a fierce acceptance. Better to meet fate head-on than to cower. The Norse concept of word, a web of destiny woven for each soul, encouraged courage. If your death was already written, why not stride into battle unflinching, or sail westward into seas unknown? Adults learned to frame their brief lives not as fragile, but as meaningful, each deed carving a mark upon the memory of kin. Even in peace, adulthood was a proving ground. The farmer who ensured his children did not starve through the winter was as honored in his way as the raider who returned with plunder. The weaver who clothed her household, the healer who gathered herbs, the blacksmith whose hammer rang out in the cold air, all bore the dignity of necessity. The Viking Age did not allow for lesser roles. Every adult's contribution was visible, measured, and remembered. And always, adulthood was about preparation for the next step, the slow march toward eldership, toward becoming the gray-haired voice whose words carried the weight of decades. In that sense, each adult lived both for the present and for the legacy that would follow. They were the bridge between childhood and ancestry, between sagas remembered and sagas yet to unfold. As the seasons turned, adulthood hardened into habit. Tasks repeated, harvests reaped, winters endured. But within that cycle lay the heartbeat of the Viking world, a culture that valued strength and endurance, yes, but also craft, loyalty, and story. To be an adult in this society was not simply to survive. It was to participate in the shaping of a world that would echo in history long after the smoke of the Longhouse fires had faded into the northern night.
The Viking Age is remembered above all for movement. Ships carving through cold seas, warriors stepping ashore on foreign lands, and the thunder of raids that shook kingdoms. Yet to truly understand the Viking hunger for horizons, we must see beyond the cliché of horned helmets and pillaging hordes. What drove Norsemen to leave the safety of their fjords, to risk the unknown waters of the North Atlantic, and to strike fear into the hearts of Europe? The answer lies in a web of necessity, opportunity, and ambition that transformed the Vikings from coastal farmers into explorers of a continent and beyond. The fjords of Scandinavia, while beautiful, were never easy places to survive. Soil was thin, winters long, and resources scarce. Population growth in the late 8th century meant that there were too many mouths for the land to feed. Farmers who once had enough to sustain a family now found themselves struggling to secure fertile ground. For many, the sea became not just an option, but a necessity. To venture outward was to seek survival. At the same time, the Vikings possessed the greatest tool for expansion in their longships. These vessels were not just ships, they were engineering marvels. Sleek, shallow-drafted, and flexible, they could cut across the open ocean or glide silently up shallow rivers.
A Viking longship could appear unexpectedly on the horizon of an English monastery or deep inland on the Seine, carrying warriors where no one thought danger could reach. This mobility created opportunity, and the Norse seized it. The earliest raids were small, sudden, and shocking. In 793, the monastery of Lindisfarne on the coast of Northumbria was devastated. Monks were slaughtered, treasures taken, and the survivors enslaved. To contemporaries, it was a catastrophe, a sign of divine punishment. To the Vikings, it was a revelation. European monasteries, often wealthy and lightly defended, made perfect targets. Word spread quickly, and soon, raiding became a central feature of Viking life. But these raids were not mindless destruction. They were calculated strikes, part of a strategy to balance necessity with profit. Gold, silver, livestock, and slaves flowed back to Scandinavia, enriching families who had once scraped by. A successful raid elevated a man's honor, drew followers to his banner, and allowed him to reward loyalty with wealth. In this way, raiding was tied as much to social status as to survival.
Still, not all Viking ventures were violent. Just as important were voyages of trade and exploration. The same ships that carried warriors also carried furs, amber, iron, and walrus ivory to markets across Europe and Asia. In return came silks, wine, spices, and silver coins stamped with Arabic inscriptions. The Vikings became part of a global network, stretching from Baghdad to Byzantium. A Norseman could stand on the frozen shores of Greenland one year and walk the bustling streets of Constantinople the next. Few cultures of the time were so widely traveled. Exploration, too, became a defining mark of Viking identity. Driven by curiosity, necessity, and sometimes exile, Norsemen pushed ever westward. They settled the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, then Greenland. Legends tell us of Leif Erikson, who around the year 1000 sailed even further, reaching the land they called Vinland, likely Newfoundland in modern Canada. If true, this made the Vikings the first Europeans to set foot in North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. These journeys were not mere raids. They were colonization efforts, attempts to carve out new homes in lands where survival might be easier than in the crowded fjords of Norway. Yet raiding never disappeared. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking fleets grew larger and more organized. No longer were they mere hit-and-run attacks. Now they were armies. They besieged Paris, invaded Ireland, and carved kingdoms in England. The great heathen army that landed in 865 was not a band of raiders, but a coordinated force, capable of holding territory and imposing rule. In these moments, the Viking hunger for horizons became empire building. But the hunger was never uniform. Some Vikings sought wealth, others land, others glory, and still others simply escape. For exiles and outcasts, the sea offered freedom. For ambitious leaders, it offered opportunity. For common farmers, it offered survival. Together, these motives fused into the great outward surge of the Viking Age. This hunger was also cultural. Norse sagas and poetry celebrated the restless spirit, the man who risked everything to find fortune abroad. A chieftain who remained home, content with small fields and modest wealth, might be seen as weak, unworthy of loyalty. To seek horizons was to prove oneself. To return with treasure was to secure fame. And in a world where honor was currency, few things mattered more. Of course, the violence of Viking raids left scars. Monasteries were burned, villages destroyed, and captives taken in chains. To the English, Irish, and Franks, the Vikings were scourges from the sea, terrifying and merciless. Chroniclers wrote of them with horror, framing their attacks as divine punishment. Yet these same chroniclers also marveled at Viking seamanship, courage, and adaptability. Even enemies could not deny their skill. Raiding and exploration reshaped Europe. Viking settlers in England eventually became rulers, blending Norse and Anglo-Saxon culture. In France, Norse chieftains carved out Normandy, a land whose name literally means Northmen. In Ireland, they founded Dublin, which began as a Viking longfort, a fortified harbor for ships. Everywhere they went, they left traces not just of destruction, but of creation. And yet, the Viking hunger for horizons was not infinite. Over time, as Christian kingdoms grew stronger, resistance to raids hardened. Fortifications multiplied, armies grew larger, and treaties replaced plunder. Many Vikings found that it was better to settle than to raid, better to trade than to steal. By the 11th century, the age of great Viking raids was fading. The hunger for horizons had not died,
but it had transformed into something new: integration into the very kingdoms they once terrorized. The story of raiding and exploration is therefore not only a tale of violence, but also of resilience, adaptability, and ambition. The Vikings were not just destroyers, they were builders, traders, explorers, and settlers. Their longships carried not only fear, but also connection, binding distant corners of the world into contact. And at the heart of it all was that hunger, the refusal to remain confined, the urge to see what lay beyond the horizon. The Viking Age began with a raid on Lindisfarne and ended with kings sitting on European thrones. Between those two moments lay centuries of adventure, fear, and transformation. It was a journey born in scarcity, but expanded through courage, ambition, and ingenuity. The Vikings, once simple farmers of the fjords, became the restless wanderers of history, men and women who carved their names on the shores of continents, driven always by the call of the horizon.
When people think of the Vikings, they often picture fleeting violence, longships crashing against foreign shores, warriors storming monasteries, and terrified villagers fleeing into the woods. But this was only the beginning of the story. The Viking Age was not defined solely by raids. It was also an age of settlement, of gradual transformation, of men and women who arrived first as raiders, but stayed as rulers. The Norse did not just plunder Europe, they became part of it, reshaping its kingdoms and leaving an imprint that still lingers today. The shift from raiding to settlement was gradual, but inevitable. Raiding provided quick rewards, but it was unstable. A single storm could scatter a fleet, a vigilant local army could turn plunder into disaster, and treasures were quickly spent. By contrast, settlement offered permanence. Fertile land could sustain generations, markets could provide steady wealth, and power could be secured not by the sword alone, but by governance. The Norse, pragmatic as ever, recognized this. One of the earliest Viking settlements outside Scandinavia was in Ireland. Beginning in the 9th century, Norsemen established fortified camps along the coast known as long forts. These bases allowed ships to dock, supplies to be stored, and raids to be launched inland. But over time, many long forts transformed into towns. The most famous example is Dublin, which began as a Viking camp around 841. From that rough base grew a thriving city, a hub of trade and culture that would endure long after the Viking Age. In fact, many of Ireland's great coastal towns, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, trace their origins to Norse foundations. In England, the pattern was even more dramatic. The arrival of the great heathen army in 865 marked not just raiding, but conquest. Led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, this force swept across Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria fell, East Anglia fell, and eventually much of central and eastern England was brought under Viking control. This region came to be known as the Danelaw, lands where Norse law, customs, and rulers held sway. Villages, farms, and markets were established, blending Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Archaeological evidence shows that Norse settlers married into local families, farmed English soil, and left behind place names still recognizable today. Towns ending in "by", meaning farmstead, like Grimsby or Derby, are Viking echoes etched into the landscape.
Yet England was not the only stage. In France, Viking raiders along the Seine grew so persistent that by the early 10th century, the Frankish king Charles the Simple made a bold move. He granted land to a Viking leader named Rollo in exchange for peace. This land became Normandy, literally the land of the Northmen. Rollo and his descendants not only embraced Christianity and French culture, but also became some of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Within a century and a half, the descendants of these Norse settlers would produce William the Conqueror, who in 1066 crossed the English Channel and claimed the crown of England. Thus, Viking settlers who once stormed monasteries now gave birth to dynasties that shaped medieval Europe. Scotland and the Isles also bore the mark of Viking settlement. The Norse established control over the Orkneys, Shetlands, and Hebrides, weaving them into a maritime network that stretched back to Norway. They founded settlements on the Isle of Man and along the coasts, where their presence blended with Celtic traditions. These areas became cultural crossroads, neither wholly Norse nor wholly native, but something in between, a hybrid identity forged in the mingling of peoples. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Vikings known as the Rus followed rivers deep into the Slavic lands. From bases around Novgorod and Kiev, they established trade routes that reached the Byzantine Empire. The very name Russia traces back to these Norsemen who settled and ruled among the Slavs. They were not conquerors alone, but mediators of trade, carrying furs, honey, and slaves southward in exchange for silks, wine, and silver. The Varangian rulers of Kiev eventually converted to Christianity, blending Norse roots with Eastern traditions and laying the foundations of a state that would endure long after the Viking Age ended. Settlement did not mean abandoning warrior ways. Many Viking colonies were still fortified, and Norse leaders continued to raid when opportunity presented itself. But over generations, the identity of these settlers shifted. Farmers tilled the soil, merchants traded in markets, children grew up speaking mixed languages, and Christianity slowly spread through the once pagan North. This cultural blending was one of the Viking Age's greatest legacies.
The shift also reshaped Viking society back home. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, those who left relieved population pressures, allowing those who remained to thrive. Wealth from settlements and trade flowed back into Scandinavia, transforming once isolated communities into players in the wider European stage. Kings emerged more powerful, drawing upon the resources and networks their people had established abroad. It is important to note that not all settlements thrived. Some, like the Norse colonies in Greenland, clung to survival on the margins of the world. Others were destroyed by resistance from locals or reclaimed by rival kingdoms. Yet even in failure, they reveal the Viking drive to carve out space, to push beyond familiar shores in search of opportunity. To the people they encountered, Viking settlements were both a threat and a bridge. In some regions, they were despised invaders, seizing land and enslaving populations. In others, they were welcomed as traders and allies. Over time, fear gave way to assimilation. The Vikings did not remain outsiders forever. They became part of the lands they had once raided, shaping their politics, economies, and cultures. By the close of the Viking Age, the transformation was unmistakable. The wild, unpredictable raiders of the 8th century had become rulers, farmers, traders, and kings. Their children no longer lived only in fjords, but in the bustling markets of Dublin, the fertile plains of England, the Duchy of Normandy, and the river routes of Kiev. The Norse had begun as raiders, but they ended as an inseparable part of Europe's medieval world. The legacy of these settlements endures. Place names, family names, traditions, and even genetic traces tie back to the Norse who crossed the seas. The Vikings did not vanish when the raiding ended. They lived on in the kingdoms they built, the dynasties they founded, and the cultures they blended. The story of the Viking Age is therefore not simply one of destruction, but of transformation, of a people who turned horizons into homes, and in doing so, reshaped the map of Europe.
Life among the Vikings was never left entirely to chaos. To imagine their society only through the lens of raids and battles is to miss what made it endure for centuries. Beneath the storms and the iron clang of weapons, there was order. A fragile but resilient framework of law, custom, and community held Viking life together, and it was this order that allowed them not only to survive in the harsh landscapes of Scandinavia, but also to build settlements across Europe. If one looks closely at the Viking world, it becomes clear that law and custom were as much a weapon of survival as the axe or the shield. The heart of this system was the Thing, the great assembly of free men. In valleys where fjords cut deeply into the land, in open meadows where hundreds could gather, or on carefully chosen sites where a flat plain stood against the horizon, the Thing was held. To us, it might resemble a primitive parliament, but to the Norse, it was far more than that. It was the soul of their society, the place where disputes were settled, marriages approved, alliances forged, and the weight of community pressed upon the individual. Every free man had the right to attend, and though voices differed in strength and influence, the act of gathering itself mattered. There, law was not abstract, but living, spoken aloud in long rhythmic recitations by the law speaker who carried the memory of countless generations. These laws were not written at first, but preserved in memory and repetition. The law speaker was more than a functionary. He was a living archive, reciting each law with precision while the assembly listened. It was said that the law speaker had to be able to chant the law for hours, day after day, without faltering. If he forgot, if he hesitated, the very legitimacy of the assembly was threatened. The reliance on memory was not weakness, but a sign of the value placed on oral tradition.
In a society where sagas, skaldic poetry, and myths were carried by voice rather than parchment, law too became part of that oral fabric. Every man who listened became a keeper of the law, even imperfectly, and this constant circulation of memory helped the laws survive until eventually written down in the medieval period. At the Thing, justice was not blind in the way we imagine it today, but it was stern. Disputes over land, inheritance, or insult were not resolved privately, but placed before the community. A man could not simply strike his neighbor and expect the matter to remain hidden. Honor demanded redress, but law channeled that redress into a system that prevented endless blood feuds. Compensation, known as weregild, could be demanded, a payment for injury or death scaled to the rank of the person harmed. A farmer's weregild was lower than that of a chieftain, but it still had to be respected. This principle restrained violence, transforming vengeance into transaction. And yet the system could never fully erase the pull of honor. When compensation was refused or insults left too deep a wound, feuds still broke out, echoing for generations in saga and song.
The Thing also gave weight to the role of community over individual will. A man could not marry without approval, could not divorce without procedure, could not make binding agreements without witnesses. The collective I was always present. To live as a Viking was to live under constant observation, not by kings or written codes, but by neighbors, kin, and peers who gathered at the assembly and remembered your choices. In that sense, law was not only a means of control, but also a mirror of values. A society that prized honor, reputation, and strength built its legal world around those same ideas. Women, too, had a place within this structure. While Viking society was patriarchal, women enjoyed rights that surprised many of their contemporaries. They could own property, request divorce, and manage estates in their husband's absence. A widow could stand as head of her household, wielding influence in both family and community affairs. The sagas often tell of women urging their husbands or sons toward action, demanding honor be upheld, or cunningly shaping outcomes behind the scenes. The law did not make them equal, but it did recognize their place, and in the fractured world of the Viking farmstead, that recognition was essential. Daily life itself was deeply tied to law and order. Farms were the backbone of survival, and boundaries had to be respected. Livestock wandered freely in summer pastures, but disputes over whose sheep grazed on whose land could spark conflict unless mediated at the Thing. Timber, water rights, and fishing grounds were fiercely guarded. Even the construction of boats, which tied families and neighbors together in shared ventures, required trust and contracts. The ship was not merely wood and sail. It was an investment of law, each man's share clear, each duty marked. Without law, cooperation would collapse. Religion, too, interwove with legal order. Oaths were sworn on sacred rings kept at temples, their weight backed by the gods themselves. To break an oath was not merely to offend men, but to offend Odin, Thor, and Freyr, who watched from the unseen world. In this way, law took on a sacred aura. When men gathered to settle disputes, they did so under the gaze of their gods, blending legal judgment with divine witness. Blot or sacrifices might accompany gatherings, reinforcing the sense that law was not simply human convenience, but cosmic order. And yet, Viking law was not rigid. It evolved with time, bending to the needs of society as it expanded into new lands. In Iceland, the Althing became one of the earliest examples of a national parliament, bringing together chiefs from across the island to resolve disputes in a land without a king. In the Danelaw of England, Norse settlers merged their customs with Anglo-Saxon traditions, creating hybrid codes that shaped the future of English law. In Dublin and York, Viking assemblies adapted to urban life, balancing trade, settlement, and governance. The law of the North was not static. It traveled, adapted, survived. The sagas preserve glimpses of this world. They speak of lawsuits that dragged on for years, of men who spoke with wit and brevity to sway the crowd, of verdicts that calmed feuds or ignited new ones. In Njál's saga, entire families are destroyed because compromise fails. In Egil's saga, sharp words at a Thing shape the fate of warriors and poets alike. Law was not separate from life, but entwined with it, and the stories that carried Viking memory kept law alive long after the last assembly was held. To live under this system was to carry both burden and protection.
The burden was constant accountability. The protection was the certainty that disputes could be channeled into order rather than chaos. In the harsh lands of the north, where winters were long and survival uncertain, this framework of law was as vital as the harvest. Without it, society would fracture into endless revenge. With it, the Vikings not only endured, but thrived, their settlements stretching across oceans, their culture strong enough to root itself in new soils. What emerges, then, is a picture of Vikings not merely as raiders or wanderers, but as builders of order. Their ships carried them across seas, but their law bound them together wherever they landed. From Norway's fjords to Iceland's plains, from Greenland's frozen edge to the riverways of Russia, the thing echoed, the law speaker's voice carrying the weight of generations. To hear it was to be reminded that survival required not only strength of arm, but also strength of community, and that in the cold world of the North, law was life. And so, when we imagine the Vikings gathered on a wind-swept plain, their cloaks drawn against the chill, listening as the law speaker recites words older than any of them, we glimpse the foundation of their society. It was not chaos that defined them, but order. Order kept alive by memory, by voice, by tradition. The laws of the North were not written on parchment, but carved into lives, binding a people together against the odds of nature and the turmoil of their own passions. That is why, long after their ships ceased to sail, their legal traditions still echo in the modern world, reminders of how even in the harshest landscapes, law can forge survival.
The Vikings are remembered most vividly for their raids, for the terror they spread when dragon-proud ships appeared suddenly on the horizon. But to stop there is to miss the deeper truth. They were not only raiders. They were explorers, traders, settlers, and connectors of worlds. The longship that carried warriors also carried merchants, envoys, and settlers. The same waterways that bore raiding parties also bore cargoes of furs, walrus ivory, slaves, amber, and silver. To understand the Viking Age is to understand that it was not simply an age of war, but an age of movement. The Norse moved more than any other people of their time, and by moving, they reshaped the world. From the coasts of Norway and Denmark, from the scattered farms of Sweden, men launched their ships not only to seek plunder, but also to seek opportunity. The North was beautiful but harsh, its soils thin, its winters long. To survive, families looked outward. The sea was not only a barrier, but a road, and to the Vikings, it was the great highway of possibility. The longship, light and flexible, able to sail with wind or be rowed against it, could slip across oceans or push inland up narrow rivers. No other vessel of its age combined speed, versatility, and shallowness of draft in the same way. Where others saw obstacles, the Vikings saw pathways. One of the earliest and most enduring trades was in furs. The cold forests of the North produced some of the finest pelts in the medieval world: sable, marten, fox, and beaver. These pelts were highly prized in Europe and beyond, symbols of wealth and refinement. From Sweden and through the Baltic, Viking traders pushed eastward, connecting with Slavic peoples and forging routes deep into the river systems of Russia. The Volga and the Dnieper became arteries of commerce, drawing Norsemen ever southward. By carrying furs from the forests of the north to the markets of Byzantium and the Caliphate, the Vikings created channels of wealth that tied the far corners of Europe to the heart of the Islamic world. The scale of this trade is difficult to imagine today. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands upon thousands of Arabic silver dirhams in Scandinavia, coins carried north by Viking merchants and buried in hoards across Sweden, Denmark, and beyond. These coins, stamped with Arabic script praising Allah, are a silent witness to the global reach of Viking trade. They remind us that the Norse world was not isolated, but deeply entangled with distant empires. For every raiding voyage that stormed a monastery, there were dozens of journeys where merchants exchanged northern furs, amber, and slaves for silk, spices, wine, and silver. The Viking Age was as much about connection as conquest. Amber, too, was a treasure of the north. Washed up from the Baltic shores, polished into beads and ornaments, it glowed with a warmth that captivated buyers far to the south. Roman traders had once prized it, and in the Viking Age, demand remained strong. A string of amber beads could travel from a wind-swept Baltic beach to the markets of Constantinople, carried along the hands of merchants who never themselves saw the northern seas. Each piece of amber, each pelt of fur, was part of a chain that linked worlds. The Viking push westward was no less significant. Settlements like Dublin began as fortified bases for raiding, but they soon became thriving hubs of commerce. Dublin became one of the richest slave markets in Europe, a place where captured men and women were bought and sold to buyers from across the continent. The trade in human beings was brutal and essential. For all their independence at home, the Vikings built part of their wealth on the enslavement of others. Slaves were seized in raids across Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe, carried in chains aboard longships, and sold far from their homes. They were traded eastward into the Caliphate or westward into markets controlled by Franks and other Europeans. This dark trade was one of the great engines of Viking wealth, reminding us that commerce is not always benevolent. And yet, the story of Viking trade was not only about exploitation, but also about creation. Wherever the Vikings went, they left behind settlements that grew into cities. York in England, once a Roman outpost, became Jorvik under Viking control, a bustling town of craftsmen, traders, and farmers. Excavations there reveal workshops filled with combs made from antler, metalwork of high skill, and evidence of international exchange. In Dublin, archaeological layers show glass from the continent, pottery from distant shores, and even fabrics that hinted contact with the Mediterranean. These were not backwaters, but cosmopolitan nodes where cultures blended. The Vikings also pushed into the North Atlantic, driven by both need and curiosity. The islands of Shetland, Orkney, and the Hebrides became stepping stones, settlements where Norse families carved farms out of rocky soil and raised their children under cold skies. From there, they went further, settling Iceland, where in the late 9th century, Norse chieftains created a society unlike any other, with no king but a system of laws and assemblies that echoed the things of their homelands. Iceland became both a sanctuary and a springboard. Families fleeing the power struggles of Norway carried their households westward, bringing with them livestock, slaves, and sagas that would one day be written down on parchment. From Iceland, still further west, they reached Greenland. Eric the Red, exiled for manslaughter, sailed there and established colonies on the fjords of its southern tip. Though the climate was harsh, Norse farmers raised sheep, goats, and cattle, building stone churches and living for centuries on that frozen edge of the world. The ruins of their farms still stand, haunting reminders of human persistence. From Greenland, the boldest voyages of all pushed into North America itself, reaching lands they called Vinland, where wild grapes and rich forests grew. Archaeological remains at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland prove that the Norse truly set foot in the New World around the year 1000, half a millennium before Columbus. These settlements did not last, but they testify to the Vikings' restless urge to push further, to see what lay beyond the horizon. Trade accompanied exploration even in these farthest reaches. Greenland exported walrus ivory, prized in Europe for carving luxury objects, and narwhal texts, which were sometimes sold as unicorn horns. These goods traveled southward, connecting the bleak Arctic waters to courts and cathedrals across Europe. Even as Viking military power waned in the 11th century, their role as traders endured, keeping them tied into the broader networks of medieval commerce. It is tempting to imagine Viking exploration as reckless wandering, but in truth, it was systematic. They used knowledge of winds, currents, and landmarks passed down orally through generations. Skalds recited verses that encoded navigational cues, while sailors trained their eyes to read the flight of birds, the color of the sea, the feel of swells beneath the hull. Sunstones, crystals that refract light, may have helped them locate the sun even when hidden by clouds. They sailed without maps, but not without knowledge, and that knowledge was collective, refined by each voyage, and shared among seafarers. What made Viking exploration remarkable was not only its range, but its dual purpose. A raid could easily turn into a trading mission if circumstances changed. A ship might arrive on foreign shores with warriors ready for battle, but if the defenses were too strong or the opportunity too small, those same men could sit down and negotiate trade. To be a Viking was to be flexible, able to seize wealth with axe or with silver, whichever proved more advantageous. Their reputation for violence made them feared, but their skill in commerce made them indispensable. European rulers hated and dreaded Viking raiders, but they also courted Viking traders because they brought goods no one else could. In this way, the Vikings wove themselves into the fabric of the medieval world. They did not simply take, they connected. Their ships linked the Arctic to Baghdad, the Baltic to Byzantium, Ireland to Iceland, Greenland to Vinland. In a time when most people lived and died within a day's walk of their birthplace, the Vikings traced arcs across half the known world.
They carried stories, technologies, and goods from one corner to another, reshaping economies and cultures as they went. Even today, the echoes of their trade remain. Silver hoards lie buried in Scandinavian soil, each coin stamped with evidence of journeys that spanned continents. Place names across Britain and Ireland preserve their language, reminders of settlements that began as trading bases. Iceland sagas record voyages to Greenland and Vinland, testaments to the farthest edges of human curiosity. The very shape of Europe's medieval economy was influenced by their movement, for the silver they carried from the East poured into Europe at a time when currency was scarce, fueling growth and change. So, when we picture Viking trade and exploration, we should not think only of raiders descending upon monasteries, though that too was part of their story. We should also imagine ships loaded with pelts gliding down Russian rivers, families stepping ashore on volcanic Iceland, merchants haggling in the crowded market of Dublin, farmers tending sheep on Greenland's frozen edge, and sailors gazing westward toward unknown shores. It was through this restless movement that the Viking Age left its deepest mark, not in fire alone, but in the web of connections that bound north to south, east to west, and past to future. And as we drift into sleep, we might consider the paradox of these people. They were feared destroyers, but also vital traders. They carried death in their axes, but life in their cargoes. They were raiders and settlers, looters and builders, feared enemies and necessary partners. In their voyages, they embodied both chaos and order, destruction and creation. The Vikings explored because they had to, because survival in the north demanded it, but also because something deeper drove them, the unending human urge to see what lies beyond the horizon.
The world of the Vikings was not only made of ships, swords, and raids. It was also shaped by stories, by gods, by a vision of the cosmos so vast and strange that it still fascinates us today. The Norse pantheon and its myths were not an abstract religion reserved for temples or priests. They were woven into the daily lives of every farmer, sailor, warrior, and weaver. For centuries, belief in these gods was the unseen force behind Viking courage, resilience, and imagination. And yet, even this mighty faith would eventually fall before the march of a new religion, Christianity. When we think of Viking religion, names like Odin, Thor, and Freya come quickly to mind. These gods were not distant, aloof beings who cared little for mortals. They were active, unpredictable, and deeply human in their flaws and strengths. Odin, the Allfather, was not a god of simple benevolence. He was wise, yes, but also cunning and ruthless, a wanderer who gave his own eye to drink from the well of wisdom. He was the god of poetry, magic, and kingship, yet also of war and death. His Valkyries chose which warriors would die in battle, carrying them to Valhalla. To invoke Odin was to embrace both brilliance and danger. Thor, his son, was the opposite in many ways. Where Odin was enigmatic and calculating, Thor was straightforward, the god of thunder, storms, and protection. Farmers, sailors, and common folk prayed to Thor because he defended the world of humans against giants and chaos. His hammer, Mjolnir, was not only a weapon, but also a sacred tool of blessing. It was used in marriages, funerals, and rituals of fertility. Archaeologists have uncovered countless small Thor's hammer pendants, showing how deeply ordinary people relied on his strength. For a Viking preparing to set sail across treacherous seas, wearing Thor's hammer was like carrying a shield of divine power. Freya embodied another vital part of Norse life, fertility, love, and beauty, but also war and death. Half of the warriors who fell in battle did not go to Odin's hall, but to hers, to the field of Folkvanger. She represents the richness of the earth, the power of love, and the mysteries of magic. Alongside her twin brother Freyr, she was tied to the cycles of harvest and prosperity. For the Vikings, whose lives depended on the land and weather, such deities were not luxuries, they were necessities. These were not the only gods. Loki, the trickster, brought chaos and deceit, yet was also an inseparable part of the divine order. Tyr embodied justice and law, though he famously sacrificed his hand to bind the monstrous wolf Fenrir. Balder, the shining god of beauty and innocence, was tragically slain, his death a symbol of fragility in a brutal world. The pantheon stretched beyond the famous few: Njord, protector of sailors; Idun, keeper of apples of youth; Hel, ruler of the dead.
Each deity represented something real and immediate to the Vikings: the sea, the storms, the harvest, the inevitability of death.
Their world was ordered by myth. At the center stood Yggdrasil, the great ash tree that connected all realms. The gods dwelled in Asgard, humans in Midgard, giants in Jotunheim. Beneath it all was Hel, while high above lay the halls of the gods. This cosmos was not eternal. From the very beginning, it was fated to end in Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. In that final battle, Odin would fall to Fenrir, Thor would slay the serpent Jormungandr, but die of its venom, and fire would consume the worlds. Out of the ashes, however, a new earth would rise, green and fertile, where survivors would rebuild. Ragnarok gave Viking faith its unique character. Unlike Christianity, which promised eternal salvation, Norse belief embraced the inevitability of death and destruction. Courage, not comfort, was the highest virtue. Warriors sought to die with honor because even the gods themselves could not escape fate. The sagas reflect this ethos. Life was short, harsh, and fragile, but glory could outlive the body. This was why stories mattered so much. They gave meaning to a world doomed to perish. Religion was not confined to temples. There were certainly sacred places, groves, springs, and great halls where sacrifices were made. At Uppsala in Sweden, Adam of Bremen described a magnificent temple where statues of Thor, Odin, and Freyr stood, and where sacrifices of animals and sometimes humans were offered. Archaeological evidence of ceremonial sites confirmed that ritual was central to Norse life. But worship also took place in homes, on ships, or in the open fields. Chieftains often acted as priests, leading sacrifices and feasts. The gods were not distant rulers, but constant companions, invoked before battles, at weddings, or in times of sickness. Sacrifice was vital. The word blot meant both sacrifice and worship. Blood from animals, horses, cattle, pigs, goats was sprinkled on altars, idols, and participants, binding community and God in shared ritual. Feasting followed, a celebration of divine blessing. In rare and desperate moments, human sacrifices were made, especially in connection with Odin, who demanded the highest price for wisdom and victory. These acts shock modern sensibilities, but in the Viking worldview, they were exchanges, offerings to maintain balance between gods and men. Myths were not just stories for children. They were cultural memory, passed orally for centuries before being written in Iceland in the sagas and Eddas. Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century Icelandic historian and poet, recorded them long after the Viking Age ended. Without him, much of this mythology would be lost. The tales he preserved of Thor's battles, Loki's tricks, Odin's sacrifices, give us not only entertainment, but a window into how Vikings saw themselves and their world.
Yet, as powerful as the old gods were, their dominion was not eternal. By the late Viking Age, Christianity spread rapidly through Scandinavia. Kings like Harald Bluetooth of Denmark and Olaf Tryggvason of Norway converted, often by both persuasion and force. Missionaries from England and Germany built churches, and by the 11th century, Christian kingdoms were replacing pagan chieftaincies. Conversion was rarely gentle. Pagan temples were burned, idols smashed, sacred groves cut down. Some communities resisted fiercely, clinging to Thor and Odin. Others accepted baptism for political survival, as Christianity brought alliance with powerful neighbors. The decline of the old faith was gradual, uneven, and complicated. Archaeologists find graves where Christian crosses are buried alongside Thor's hammer pendants, showing how people blended beliefs for generations. Even after conversion, Norse myths did not vanish. They slipped into folklore, shaping fairy tales, legends, and rural traditions. The memory of gods like Odin and Thor lingered long in poetry and place names. Even today, their echoes remain in our own language. Wednesday is Odin's day, Thursday is Thor's day, Friday is Freya's day. To the Vikings, religion was not simply about gods, but about identity. Their myths gave meaning to hardship, their rituals bound communities together, and their gods stood beside them on stormy seas and bloody battlefields. The eventual Christianization of Scandinavia ended one era, but it did not erase what came before. Instead, Norse mythology endured, carried forward in manuscripts, in folklore, and in the fascination it continues to inspire.
From Wagner's operas to Marvel films, from Tolkien's Middle-earth to modern fantasy novels, the gods of the Vikings still stride through our imagination. And so, the old faith lives on, not as worship, but as memory, a testament to how deeply the Vikings believed that their lives were part of something greater than themselves, something written in the stars and sung by the Skalds. Their gods were flawed, mortal in their own ways, yet eternal in story. Even as Christianity triumphed, the Norse pantheon refused to vanish. Instead, it became legend, shaping how we remember the Vikings not only as warriors, but as storytellers of the storm, guardians of myths that still echo through the centuries.
The Viking Age did not end with a single battle or a single year. It faded gradually, like the last glow of a fire on the horizon. From the late 8th century, when longships first struck terror along the coasts of England, Ireland, and France, to the mid-11th century, when Harold Hardrada fell at Stamford Bridge in 1066, the Vikings transformed Europe. They were raiders, traders, settlers, explorers, and kings. By the time their age closed, they had left behind kingdoms, cities, stories, and a legacy so enduring that we still invoke their name with awe. But the end of this age was as fascinating as its beginning, for it revealed not only the decline of an old way of life, but also the birth of new societies built on Viking foundations. The decline began not because the Vikings lost their ferocity, but because the world around them changed. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe had been fragmented, full of vulnerable monasteries and small kingdoms that could not resist swift raids. By the 11th century, stronger states were rising. England, once a patchwork of petty kingdoms, was now unified, able to field armies against Viking invaders. France had grown more centralized, its nobles better organized. The Holy Roman Empire projected power across Germany and Italy. Against these growing powers, even the most daring Viking raiders found less opportunity. Christianity was another force reshaping the north. By the year 1000, much of Scandinavia had converted, at least in name, to the Christian faith. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson in Norway, Harald Bluetooth in Denmark, and Olaf Skotkonung in Sweden all embraced baptism. Conversion was often political as much as spiritual. Christian rulers gained allies in Europe, legitimacy from the church, and new tools of administration. Yet this also meant the slow erosion of the old pagan traditions that had defined Viking identity. Sacrifices to Odin and Thor gave way to the ringing of church bells. Wooden temples were replaced with stone churches. The myths of Ragnarok and Valhalla retreated into folklore, surviving only in the poetry of Iceland. But Christianity alone did not end the Viking way of life. Paradoxically, many Viking leaders themselves accelerated the transformation by building kingdoms and dynasties that no longer relied on raiding. Rollo, the Viking who carved out Normandy in northern France, became the ancestor of dukes and kings who would one day conquer England. In England, Danish kings like Knut the Great built empires that stretched across Denmark, Norway, and England itself, proving that the Viking talent for conquest could also be turned into stable rule. These rulers needed taxation, administration, and law more than they needed endless raiding. Slowly, the old culture of seaborne plunder gave way to statecraft.
The battles of the 11th century mark both the glory and the twilight of the Viking Age. In 1014, Brian Boru, High King of Ireland, defeated Viking forces at the Battle of Clontarf, ending centuries of Scandinavian dominance in Ireland. In 1066, Harald Hardrada of Norway launched one last audacious invasion of England. His forces met King Harold Godwinson at Stamford Bridge. The battle was fierce, but the Norwegians were cut down, and Hardrada himself was slain. Chroniclers describe his death as the end of the great Viking invasions. Only 3 weeks later, Harold himself fell to the Normans at Hastings, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France. In this way, the Viking legacy did not end, but transformed, flowing into the veins of European history. Beyond warfare, the Vikings had reshaped the map of the world. Their settlements spread across the British Isles, where cities like Dublin, York, and Limerick grew out of Viking trading posts. In Normandy, they left behind a dynasty that would dominate medieval Europe. In the east, they founded the Rus principalities, the ancestors of modern Russia and Ukraine. In the far north, Iceland became a center of literature, where the sagas were written. Even Greenland bore their mark, and for a time, so too did the coast of North America, where Leif Erikson and his crew reached Vinland. Few cultures of the Middle Ages had such a wide impact. What made the Vikings endure in memory was not only their deeds, but their adaptability. They were not simply raiders with axes. They were merchants who connected the silver mines of the Middle East to the markets of Scandinavia, carrying coins, silk, and spices. They were settlers who integrated into foreign lands, marrying locals, adopting languages, and blending cultures. They were craftsmen whose shipbuilding techniques influenced naval design for centuries. They were storytellers whose sagas preserved a vision of life both harsh and heroic. Their legacy was multifaceted, and it grew even as the age of raids came to an end. By the 12th century, Scandinavia itself was no longer the land of pagan raiders. It was divided into Christian kingdoms, ruled by monarchs who commissioned cathedrals, minted coins, and enforced law codes. The wild independence of the Viking chieftains was tamed, replaced by dynastic politics and feudal obligations. Yet the warrior ethos of the Old World did not vanish. It lived on in the proud traditions of Scandinavian kingship, in the continued skill of their seafarers, and in the enduring pride of their people.
Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Vikings was cultural. The sagas written in Iceland preserved not only the memory of the gods, but also the lives of explorers, farmers, and heroes. These stories are not simple chronicles of battle, but reflections on fate, honor, and survival. They capture the hardship of farming in the north, the joy of feasting, the pain of exile, and the thrill of discovery. In them, we glimpse not just the warrior, but the human being, complex, flawed, and resilient. Even the English language carries echoes of the Vikings. Everyday words like sky, egg, knife, and husband come from Old Norse. Place names across England, ending in by, thorpe, or thwaite, mark where Vikings settled. In Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, Norse influence is visible in art, law, and tradition. Their presence seeped so deeply into the fabric of Europe that it cannot be separated. The image of the Viking has changed through time. Medieval monks saw them as demons, scourges sent by God to punish sinners. Later, nationalists in Scandinavia romanticized them as noble ancestors. In the 19th century, artists painted them as horn-helmeted warriors, a myth that persists even though archaeology has disproved it. Today, they fascinate us anew as symbols of adventure, freedom, and raw endurance. Popular culture has turned them into heroes, villains, and everything in between. Yet behind these images lies the reality of a people who were at once practical and imaginative, brutal and creative, destroyers and builders. The end of the Viking Age did not mean the end of the Vikings. Their descendants ruled as kings, built kingdoms, and left an imprint across Europe. The raids ceased, but the legacy endured. The longships no longer prowled the seas, but their memory still rides the waves of history. Even in death, the Vikings achieved what they valued most: immortality in story. When we speak of them now, we are not just recalling warriors of the North. We are remembering explorers who reached new worlds, poets who carved their verses into the air, farmers who struggled against a hard land, and families who built communities at the edge of the known world. Their age ended, but their spirit, restless, resilient, and unafraid of the horizon, never truly died. It is why we still look to the north and feel the echo of their oars, the shadow of their sails, and the fire of their legends. The Viking Age closed with kings instead of chieftains, with churches instead of temples, with dynasties instead of raids. But it never vanished. It simply became part of us. Their gods faded, their ships rotted, their swords rusted, but their stories survived. And as long as we tell them, the Vikings will never be gone.
If you made it all the way to the end, type the words of Ragnar Lothbrok from Vikings. How the little piggies will grunt when they hear how the old boar suffered. Don't forget to subscribe. Good night and farewell, traveler.